My name is Sarah. I'm a 43-year-old woman, and even today I find it hard to believe what happened to me. Last month I was traveling to Las Vegas and decided to stay at a modest motel along the way. It seemed like a quiet and safe place. It was around 4:15 in the morning and I was sleeping in my room when suddenly the phone in my room rang. Who could it be at this hour? I thought. Given the time, I assumed it was the guy at the front desk who had to communicate something important to me, but it wasn't. I answered and there was a male voice on the other end saying, "Hi, are you Sarah?" "Yes," I replied. The voice on the other end started saying, "Sarah, Sarah, 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 what a beautiful name." I felt a shiver down my spine. He said it in a tone I didn't like at all. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He told me he was an old high school friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know what to think. I was confused. Reflecting on it, I remembered some of my former classmates with whom I had recently reconnected on social media. It could be one of them, I thought, but I couldn't explain how he knew I was there in that remote motel. I continued the conversation with that man for a few minutes, trying to get as much information as possible and understand who he was. I asked for his name and which school we had attended together. He replied with a smile that his name was John, and I was amazed when he said the exact name of the school. At some point, I asked him, "How did you know I'm here in this motel?" The answer was a long silence followed by a sigh. Something was wrong. It was as if someone was playing with me, but I didn't understand what his intent was. I decided to end the call, saying that I was tired and needed to sleep. The man didn't seem upset and bid me farewell with a slightly sinister voice. "See you soon, Sarah." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was filled with anxiety and unanswered questions. Who was that man really? How did he find me? What did he want from me? After a few hours, the sun rose. I prepared to leave the room to go to the front desk, but I was scared at the thought that that man might be out there somewhere. Fortunately, in the distance, I saw a woman coming out of her room and I approached her so as not to be alone. As soon as I arrived at the front desk, I approached the motel manager and began to tell with trembling voice what had happened to me. I described the unusual phone call I received and my fear of being targeted by someone unsavory. The woman, who had just come out of the room with a worried look, listened carefully as I spoke. The receptionist, while I was telling him what happened, maintained a neutral expression the whole time. After finishing telling what happened, the woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. Then, with a tense voice, she said she had experienced a similar situation. She too had received a strange phone call from a man with a disturbing tone who had asked her inappropriate questions and knew many things about her. After listening to her words, I felt even more scared and vulnerable. It was evident that we were both facing the same situation. We looked at each other with worried looks, wondering who that man could be. At that point, feeling in danger and not knowing what to do, we decided to immediately call the police and explain the situation to them. A few minutes later, the officers arrived at the motel. With professionalism and determination, the officers listened carefully to our testimonies, noting every detail. They tried to reassure us, guaranteeing that they would do everything possible to resolve the situation and ensure our safety. The officers immediately began to investigate, trying to trace the origin of the phone calls. After about 15 minutes, they discovered that the calls had been made from a payphone about 5 miles from the motel. This meant that the man at the time of the call was in the area, which further increased our concern. Despite the difficulties in tracking down the individual, the officers worked tirelessly to identify that man. Knowing that the police were doing everything possible made us feel safer. Shortly after, both I and that woman left the motel. We exchanged phone numbers to occasionally hear from each other to support each other. It was important for both of us to have someone to share our concerns with and update each other on the situation, especially if that man tried to contact us again. 2 days later, the police managed to identify the man through the phone calls. He was an individual already known to the authorities for similar crimes. He was a serial criminal who had already committed several acts of harassment and stalking. The news filled us with relief, but at the same time with anger and dismay at the idea that such a dangerous person had been so close to us. The officers then discovered that the man had gathered information about us through various sources, including social media. He used to carefully monitor the movements of all the women he targeted and had access to personal information such as names, phone numbers, and places of residence. He used this information to create a kind of pattern to contact his victims, inducing them to start a conversation with him and intimidate them by providing all the details about them he possessed. This modus operandi demonstrates not only his dangerousness, but also his cunning in manipulating his victims and making them feel vulnerable and threatened. Fortunately, thanks to the prompt action of the police, it was possible to stop his criminal activities and ensure that he was brought to justice. To this day, it remains a mystery how the man came to know that both I and that woman were at that motel that night. My name is Lucas. I'm from Brazil, and tennis has always been my greatest passion. Since I was young, I've spent hours and hours on tennis courts, honing my skills and enjoying every moment of play. There's nothing that makes me feel more alive and free than hitting the ball with my racket, feeling its bounce on the court, and running towards it with determination. I've always dreamed of gracing the courts of Wimbledon or winning a Grand Slam. But as the years passed and the inevitable responsibilities of adult life set in, that dream seemed increasingly out of reach. Unfortunately, work and daily commitments began to take precedence over my passion. Over time, I accepted that perhaps that dream was not meant to come true and decided to find a stable job to ensure financial stability. Currently, I live alone in an apartment in the heart of the city. One day I was off from work and at home. As I was lost in my thoughts, the phone rang. It was an old childhood friend, one of the companions with whom I spent whole days playing on the courts. His voice was impatient, full of enthusiasm. He offered me a job at a prestigious tennis club located in a city 300 miles away from mine. I couldn't believe it. At that moment, my heart began to beat fast. I remember it was an indescribable emotion. Perhaps finally destiny was opening a window to my dream. I didn't hesitate for a moment. Taking advantage of the fact that I had no family ties or other commitments holding me back, I immediately accepted the opportunity. That same day, I began to pack my things frantically, encountering some memories as I packed my personal belongings into boxes for the move. I looked around the apartment that I loved so much, aware that I was about to leave behind an important chapter of my life. But the excitement of what awaited me was too strong to allow myself to dwell on feelings of nostalgia. With my heart full of joy and hope for the future, the next day, in the afternoon, I loaded my car with all my belongings, closed the door of the apartment for the last time, and left. After a few hours of driving, I decided to stop at a motel along the way to rest and continue the journey the next day. I never would have imagined that night would be anything but restful. After parking the car, I headed to the reception to inquire about room availability. Fortunately, that evening, all the rooms were vacant, except one. Once I got the keys, I headed towards the room assigned to me. It was number 7. As soon as I entered, I noticed that the room was quite dated, neglected, but it didn't matter. My happiness at that moment was too great to be disturbed by such insignificant details. After about half an hour, I lay down on the bed trying to fall asleep. Shortly after, I began to hear noises coming from the next room. Initially, they were just barely perceptible whispers, but then gradually they began to intensify. I tossed and turned in bed for about an hour, trying to ignore them, but with little success. Those weren't just random noises, but sounds that evoked overwhelming passion. I could hear the voices, the muffled laughter, the subdued moans. It was clear that a man and a woman were sharing a moment of intimacy and passion in the room next to mine. I couldn't help but be disturbed by the situation. I felt like my peace was being violated. It began to bother me. At one point, I pounded on the wall forcefully, hoping to make them stop, and for a brief moment it seemed to work. Unfortunately, the quiet lasted very little. Those sounds, if we can call them that, resumed with even more intensity. I started pounding on the wall again, but the two in the next room didn't seem to stop. The passion of the two strangers continued to echo in my head, making any attempt at rest impossible. Frustrated and tired, I desperately tried to find a comfortable position in bed, hoping that sleep would take me in a merciful embrace. However, every movement of my body was accompanied by that annoying background noise that seemed endless. In the end, I managed to rest only a bit towards dawn, when the two in the next room probably fell asleep exhausted, or at least so I thought. In the morning, I was awakened by a knock on the door. I immediately got out of bed, and with my heart in my throat, I headed towards the door. As soon as I opened it, I found myself facing two police officers with serious and focused faces. A shiver ran down my spine. One of the officers stared at me in the eyes without saying anything. I couldn't understand what was happening. I remained silent for a few seconds when suddenly he said, "Did you hear anything suspicious last night?" Meanwhile, the other officer scrutinized my expression carefully, looking for any signs of nervousness or uncertainty. With a dismayed expression, I nodded in agreement, confirming that I had heard sounds and noises coming from the next room. I was agitated. My mind began to race frantically, thinking of the worst. As the officers took note of my words carefully, I suddenly felt involved in a situation that went far beyond my quiet, interrupted night. When they opened the door to the next room, they found no one inside. Neither the man nor the woman were present, immediately drawing the attention of the officers. The two had left without saying anything, taking the keys to the room with them and leaving their documents at the reception without picking them up. Inside the room, on the desk, they found a camera. The officers, curious, decided to examine it. The recordings inside revealed the entire night of passion between the two. It turned out that the two were ex-lovers who were trying to rekindle their relationship. As the officers continued their investigation, it emerged that the man turned out not to be a reliable individual. On the contrary, he had been involved in some legal troubles in the past, further fueling concerns about the safety and well-being of the woman. Even today, the two have not been found. Who knows where in the world they are now, and what reasons led them to leave the motel in that way, without giving any explanation. Despite the time that has passed, their disappearance continues to raise questions and hypotheses.